Three things happened in the year that followed the second engagement, and each of them changed humanity in ways that the species would spend centuries understanding. The first was Mehta's translation. Working with a team that had grown to include linguists, mathematicians, musicians, and at least one architect whose contribution none of the others could fully explain but all agreed was essential, Mehta completed his partial decoding of the alien vessel's records and found, buried in the deepest layers of the catalog, something that none of them had thought to look for. A classification system, a taxonomy of species encountered, assessed, and acted upon, stretching back across a span of time that made human civilization look like an afternoon. Hundreds of entries, each corresponding to a world the alien civilization had visited and evaluated according to criteria that Mehta's team was only beginning to understand. Every entry in the catalog ended the same way, with a notation that Mehta translated after 6 weeks of careful work as something between the concepts of concluded and resolved. Every entry, that is, except the most recent one. The entry corresponding to a small, unremarkable planet orbiting an average star in an undistinguished arm of the galaxy, whose dominant species had apparently done something in the outer reaches of its solar system that the catalog's notation system had no existing category for. The entry was marked, in the alien taxonomy, with a symbol that appeared nowhere else in the entire record. Mehta spent 2 weeks attempting to translate it before concluding that the closest human concept was not a word but a posture, the particular stillness of something very old and very confident that has just, for the first time, encountered a reason to be careful. The second thing that happened was the signal. It arrived not as a weapon but as a transmission, in a format that suggested deliberate construction rather than automated broadcast, directed precisely at the coordinates where the Resolute had been stationed during the first engagement. Someone had been watching that battle, had noted the position of the surviving ship, and had waited a full year before sending. The content of the transmission was dense and took 8 months to partially decode, but its basic structure, once understood, was unmistakable. It was not a threat. It was not an apology. It was the opening move of something that no word in any human language quite captured, because humanity had never been in this particular position before, the position of a species that something larger and older and more powerful had decided was worth talking to rather than resolving. The catalog, it turned out, had a first page, and humanity had just been written onto it in a category of its own. The third thing that happened was quieter than the other two, and in the long accounting of history, it mattered more than either of them. Voss retired from Fleet Command on a cool morning in Geneva, surrounded by people who had prepared speeches, and found, when the moment arrived, that the speeches felt insufficient. She had spent the intervening year doing what commanders do after the immediate emergency passes, writing reports, attending councils, translating the raw, terrible knowledge she carried into protocols and training programs and tactical doctrines that would outlast her. She had read every name on the 3 manifests she had transmitted from the Resolute's bridge, and attended every memorial she had been physically capable of attending, and spoken to families when they wanted to be spoken to and given them silence when they didn't. She left Geneva on a transport heading for a small observatory in the mountains, where an old friend had offered her a quiet room and access to a telescope and no obligations whatsoever for as long as she wanted them. On the night she arrived, she climbed to the telescope platform and looked out at the sky for a long time without using any instrument at all. The stars were the same stars she had looked at her entire life, unchanged by everything that had happened beneath them. Orion still stood at his old angle. The Milky Way still arched overhead in its patient, indifferent splendor, full of 100 billion stars and whatever moved between them in the dark. But she did not look at the sky the way she had looked at it before, the way everyone had looked at it before, as a beautiful and empty ceiling above a world that stood alone. She looked at it the way you look at a room full of strangers after you have learned that at least one of them knows your name. Not afraid, not comfortable either. Simply present and awake, and aware of what awareness cost. Somewhere out in that vast and ancient dark, something had looked back at humanity and written in its catalog a symbol it had never written before, in a record that stretched back further than humanity had known how to count. And somewhere closer, in a room she had not yet been able to bring herself to visit, a family was still learning to keep living in a world where a girl who had wanted nothing more than to see the stars up close had finally gotten exactly what she'd wanted and had not come back. Voss stayed on the platform until the cold drove her inside, and then a little longer after that. The stars did not move. They never did. They simply burned, patient and distant, illuminating everything they touched and explaining nothing, the way they had always done, the way they would continue to do long after every question humanity had thought to ask them had finally been answered or forgotten. She went inside. She made tea. She sat at the window and watched the light change, and thought about what it meant to be the kind of creature that looked up and asked, and kept asking, even when the answer came back in the form of something enormous and armed and deeply certain. It had nothing to learn from anything as small and brief and stubborn as a human being. It meant, she decided, something she was not yet ready to put into words. She had time to find them. That was the whole point. That was what 3 ships had bought, at a price she would carry in her chest like a stone for the rest of her life. She had time.